This is Fit to Succeed in partnership with NordicFitnessEducation.com with hosts Ben Pratt. Thanks for joining us.
So if calories and protein are the same in two diets, it doesn't matter whether that diet is super low in carbohydrate or more moderate to higher intake of carbohydrate for fat loss specifically. For most people, in the vast majority of cases, I think starting with a pretty high protein intake is typically a useful strategy.
Okay, welcome to another Fit to Succeed podcast. My name is Ben Pratt and I'm here today with a fantastic guest. You may know him as the host of Sigma Nutrition Radio. His name is Danny Lennon and he is also a performance coach, has a master's degree, and a great example of somebody who is going to help us get into the nuance of some nutritional detail today. Danny, it's great to have you with us.
Thanks so much for having me, Ben. I really appreciate this and I'm looking forward to a good conversation.
Yeah, me too. I really appreciate you being here. Now, you have a career where you work in a few different fields, and particularly you're a strength coach. You are an athlete yourself. You've got an interest in powerlifting. You chose, despite that being where you began, you chose to take your skills and focus a master's degree in nutrition. What motivated you to expand your abilities in this regard, to go into that field in a very big way?
Yeah, so I suppose the short answer is pretty much how I think a lot of people end up getting into whatever field they're interested in is as I was growing up in my teenage years and as I went into college, my main focus was on playing various different sports. That was the first thing that got me into the gym to start lifting to try and supplement my performance in different sports. And when I first went to university, I started studying biology and physics. So that was where I was really introduced to learning how to look up peer-reviewed research, looking at research journals, being able to interpret them. And so really as a hobby in my own time, I tried to look for things that would help my own performance in sports, purely just on a selfish basis. What can I do to help? Nothing to do with my course at the time. And so obviously I looked at stuff related to like sports psychology, physiology and exercise science, nutrition obviously played a role. And as I started reading some of the nutrition stuff, it just was the one thing that kind of stood out to me as really fascinating. And not only the impact it could have on athletic performance, but just the huge all-around impact it has on health and quality of life. And so I just kind of got deeper and deeper down that rabbit hole. Mm-hmm. And fast forward a few years, I graduated from university. I had came out and been a qualified science teacher here in Ireland, had done that for a year, but had just decided this nutrition thing, I was spending so much time just reading research on it. I was like, why don't I go do something here? And took the decision to quit teaching. Went back and did my master's degree in nutritional science and then just started working in that field from there on. And then fast forward to now and here we are.
Oh, fantastic. That's interesting that it was education itself that sparked that interest in nutrition. It wasn't necessarily from experience per se, but it was, your own delving into knowledge and trying to understand that science.
Yeah, for sure, because I think a lot of the stuff that I came across when I started reading that research was counter to a lot of the ideas that we tend to have, probably generated by mainstream media about nutrition, like what is a healthy diet, what should we be doing? And I'd grown up hearing like the standard messaging around like you need to eat a super low fat diet, and I had done idiotic things like reading the back labels of food and trying to see what had the lowest amount of saturated fat in it, as opposed to considering the overall quality of the diet and understanding micronutrients and macronutrients and how these each played a role for various different things. And so as I started learning more and more, I started to see how maybe a lot of it was a bit different to what I typically believed. And that was probably one of the big things that wanted to get me to stay reading, because it was different to what I presumed I would find.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Perhaps before we start to delve into some detail, because today I really want to cover some specific topics with you, but I wonder if we could just start on looking at what your thoughts are on the broader role that nutrition might play when someone's working with a client to help them achieve their health and fitness objectives.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many ways to take this question, but I think from personal experience, and I'm sure a lot of personal trainers and coaches listening will have seen this as well, is that so often when someone comes to us for advice with diet and help with their nutrition, a lot of that tends to be motivated for fat loss, and that they want to improve their body composition. And sure, that can be an important role, particularly for someone who's overweight or obese. Just improving that body composition can lead to health benefit. But I think the big thing that speaks to this overview of the general role of nutrition that you talk about is when you see people make progress through dietary changes, the stuff that they start reporting as beneficial to them was things that were different that they'd never considered before. So I've had overweight or obese clients that, sure, they wanted to get in a bit better shape, but the thing that really changed their whole life for the better was after they started eating better and understood dietary decisions and what foods they should be consuming versus the kind of poor habits they had before, and they start making this change. Then they get to a place where now they're suddenly waking up and not still being tired in the morning. They're not feeling sluggish throughout the day. They have the energy to do things. Walking in and out to the car with bags of shopping is no longer as difficult as it was. Getting up a flight of stairs, being able to go out and play with their kids in the garden, whereas before they weren't able to. All these things that are kind of secondary knock-on effects. Similarly, they can now sleep properly. They're not getting issues like sleep apnea. So it's sure they came initially because they wanted to lose some body fat, but the life-changing things that speak to just how big a role nutrition can have are all those kind of secondary things that people see. So that's just kind of one experience that I'm sure a lot of coaches would have seen, and kind of speaks to the idea of just how broad-reaching nutrition can be and pretty much can affect every area of our lives, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, that you've raised some really great points there, and particularly if there's any fitness professionals who are listening to this who currently don't invest a lot of time with their clients in nutrition. You know, you've shared a huge number of reasons as to why they should, because of those, like you said, secondary knock-on effects. Now, one thing I would say about nutritional science that I've come across, Danny, is there's hugely polar opposite views. You know, you get people who are meant to be experts completely disagreeing with one another, or sometimes it can appear that way, that they're completely disagreeing. And it can be confusing and challenging for perhaps newer fitness professionals coming into the industry to understand, as you experience, what should they listen to. You know, you said at the beginning there that, you know, looking for saturated fat on a label as low as possible, and you refer to that as an idiotic approach, because I assume now you've learned and gained knowledge that has made you think that that isn't a good strategy, but there may be those out there who still consider it. So perhaps to try and kind of get through that, you know, maybe could you share your steps as how you would move forward in trying to formulate a decision with regards to what might be an effective strategy?
Sure. So probably to clarify, just for those listening about the kind of saturated fat comment, it's not necessarily that I've gone to the other extreme of saturated fat as this super healthy thing we need to be dosing ourselves really high with. It's more the fact of focusing specifically on one nutrient like that,
sure,
regardless of the whole broad perspective of this particular meal or my overall diet, is kind of the idiotic mistake, as opposed to trying to avoid saturated fat or lower it, for example. And there's people that thrive on a...
Sorry to interrupt. I was just going to say, you raise a good point, which I think will probably bolster our discussion, which is just because we're saying that having the lowest saturated fat intake isn't desirable doesn't mean we should go to the contrasting extreme. So sorry, right. Carry on.
Yeah, no, absolutely agree, and I'm sure that will come back up in our discussion later on. So just to clarify for people, that's the kind of the idiotic thing to me is nothing to do with like specific nutrients. It's more the mindset I was in of make all my decisions based on like this one isolated thing, as opposed to understanding the entirety of my diet. Like you say, with trying to navigate all this information, I have so much empathy for people who are trying to learn more but are just bombarded by completely conflicting ideologies. And I agree, it's so hard to decipher, because not only is there like the obvious pseudoscientific quackery on one end, because most of us can kind of see, okay, this person's a bit of a crazy person. But now there's this emergence of what I think is a dishonest use of science. It's people who are medical doctors, people who maybe are even dietitians, people who are fitness professionals, people who are generally smart, who are using scientific language and maybe even pointing to specific pieces of scientific research to build their own case. But they're doing it in a way that isn't really the way science is intended. It's not looking at the consensus of information. It's not looking at the entirety of work we have in this area and seeing which way it leans. It's kind of cherry picking certain data points. It's looking for stuff to confirm their own bias, and they're just able to do it in a way with enough scientific language to make it sound like they're smart. And a lot of these people are smart, but it's just they have an agenda. So it's extremely difficult for people to decipher. So I think that's typically why I tend to say to practitioners that the foundation for most of your practice should be one of evidence-based practice. And this is a great model where you essentially have these three components of building your recommendations to clients on one, the current best practices within based on kind of research that's been done. So where is the consensus of scientific data on this particular topic? Not just one outlier piece of research or something someone said that sounds sciencey. In general, when you look at most of the data in this area, where would the research in that area say we're kind of leaning towards? So for example, you could find one research paper that shows creatine supplementation had zero effect on athletic performance, right?
Sure.
Looking at that and saying, I'm never going to tell anyone to take creatine is not scientific. That is not a good way to use science. It's a misinterpretation. What you would do is look at, okay, on the average, where does most of the data in this area lean? And the vast, vast majority shows a benefit for creatine supplementation and performance. So that would be using evidence in an appropriate manner. On top of that, with evidence-based practice, you layer two other components. One is your own expertise and experience as a coach. So it's not just focusing on only what you can find research on. It's understanding, well, what have I done in the past with this particular client? What have I done with other clients? What has my own experiences told me is an effective strategy to implement with people? What do people in the real world actually respond well to in terms of how I communicate these certain recommendations? And then the final piece is the specific needs and requirements of that individual, because they could be an individual that in a research setting could have been the outlier on that point, that they didn't respond well to what the average of the group did. So testing different things, making sure that your starting place is good evidence-based recommendations based on our current literature, but then not being afraid to kind of tweak that based on the individual in front of you and to see what they respond well to. And if they're progressing, then great. And so that kind of model of evidence-based practice is a good start point. The kind of trickier thing is, like you say, for someone just getting into the field, how do you get to the point of being able to decipher what recommendations are evidence-based? There's a few kind of red flags we could point out. Some that I've said before, when someone is pointing to just a couple of specific studies and ignoring a lot of other data. When someone is very absolutist in their claims is probably a red flag most of the time as well. So if they tell you there is one best method to do X, there is one best diet for someone to lose body fat, generally that's going to be a big red flag that this person either has a bias or agenda that they're pushing. Whereas what you're probably looking for is someone who has a bit more nuanced perspective of being able to point out the limitations to any particular type of way of doing it, saying that there's not one answer, but a general good starting point for most people is probably this. Using language like that is probably a good way to go. And then from there, trying to seek out individuals that you deem to be trustworthy and being able to call on them. Because as a fitness professional, when you consider all the time people are going to be doing coaching as they should be, it's going to leave very limited time, either one, to go and study how to interpret this stuff. And even if you have that background already, to be able to go through the primary research yourself, it's going to be impossible. So having a good network of people who are trustworthy, who you can call on in their certain area of expertise and know that they're going to give you sound, sensible, non-sensationalist advice is probably a good way to do it. There's some resources out there that we can mention if you want, but generally different ways to kind of build up that kind of network of trustworthy people is probably a way to shortcut a lot of that.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much in that answer of great value there. I really like that three-step approach of focusing on what is the I suppose the bigger picture of evidence that exists rather than just one little study. Then looking at your own experience as you work as a fitness professional, and then also looking at the client's experience as they try to apply your advice. That also feeds into what often happens in science, as you kind of alluded to, which is just because a study makes a conclusion at the end and says, our data showed this was the common or the most observed experience. As you said, there's almost always high and low responders, or high reaction, low reaction, and so we will find that there are people who were in that group who applied the same process and it didn't work.
Absolutely.
And I think when people understand that, this is why we can't do a one-size-fits-all approach, particularly in the field of nutrition.
Yeah, I remember talking to Dr. Mike Zordos on this before, and he had a kind of great way of thinking. He said, when you're considering research, essentially it's conceptual in nature. So it's there to show you whether a certain concept works. It's not there to show you this is the method to go and use with your clients. So if you have a piece of research looking on a specific type of high intensity interval training, for example, and it shows a benefit for that group, does that mean, oh, well, this is what I'm going to go and use with all my clients? It's like, no, what it shows is for this group of college students that did this specific protocol for 4 weeks, they got a slightly better result than doing this other approach that was compared to. That doesn't mean it's going to be the best thing for everyone. It might not be, even in a practical sense, it might not be useful. Are you going to go and use that with a 65-year-old female client that you have that has just came to you for the first time? It's like, no, right? So it's there to inform you about certain concepts. Is this one going to have some benefits here or there, and kind of highlight some of that stuff? But then you take what you read there and see how can I synthesize that into my current understanding, my current practices, as opposed to throwing the baby out with the bathwater and saying I need to base everything I say to people on this specific research study. So yeah, I agree. I think that's a good point you bring up.
Yeah, and so really what you're sort of getting at there is the power of understanding any research in context, being able to see it for what it is, and then to use that information to inform good practice, but not to just perhaps put everything you previously thought to one side, but to sort of go, okay, that might have changed my perspective. How am I going to work with that going forward? So,
absolutely agreed.
Now, on your Sigma Nutrition podcast, obviously you've interviewed, you're up into the 200s now of guests that you've interviewed. And in that process, one of the subjects that's come up again and again, perhaps because it is a very topical issue over the last few years, is the issue between how we best, as the way many people look at it, manage people's body weight if they are trying to lose weight. Now, more than 60 to 70% of people who engage in the gym have been surveyed to have a desire to lose weight. So it's a big thing in the fitness professional's life. I guess my question, having just given that context, is can you perhaps, I want to address this particular subject for the bunch of the podcast now, is as it's a very polar discussion as to whether low carb is effective or low calorie is effective, perhaps you might just give us a brief outline of some of the key issues, and then we can begin to get into some of the details around that particular discussion.
Sure. So when it comes down to the nutritional factors that manipulate or change or cause a change in body composition, there's kind of a set number of things we could probably look at. Some that you've mentioned there: energy balance, so calories in, calories out, the macronutrient breakdown, micronutrients, hydration status, supplements, all that type of stuff. However, by a large margin, the number one thing that's going to dictate change in terms of weight loss over time is going to be someone's energy balance. So that trade-off between calories in and calories out. And if someone wants to lose a considerable amount of body fat over a prolonged period, then they are going to need to be on average for a set period of time chronically in a calorie deficit. So under eating on calories, or their expenditure is going to far exceed their intake. And I suppose the confusion that comes up is people tend to think, okay, if you're saying that, are you saying the best method is just to count calories, or calories are the only thing that matter? And that's just a complete straw man argument against what's being said. That's not what I'm saying at all. We're pretty clear on just telling people eat less calories isn't really a good, effective strategy in the real world. If you just give that piece of advice in isolation, it doesn't go to say that the macronutrient content of diet doesn't matter for an individual. It's not saying that food quality doesn't matter. All those things do have a large impact. However, if someone's goal is fat loss, you could try and optimize whatever else you want. You can put them on a low carb diet. You can put them eating the best quality foods. You can give them whatever supplements you want. If you get that person to eat enough calories that exceeds their current level of maintenance calories, they will start gaining weight, right? And they certainly won't be losing weight over that period of time. So it's pretty clear that to induce fat loss, we want to put someone in a calorie deficit over a prolonged period. In terms of, from a physiological perspective, the kind of argument that does carbohydrate restriction lead to more fat loss in those conditions, so far, any of the data that's kind of tried to examine this from a physiological perspective seems to show that it's not superior to a diet that is of a higher amount of carbohydrate but is matched for calories and protein. So if calories and protein are the same in two diets, it doesn't matter whether that diet is super low in carbohydrate or a more moderate to higher intake of carbohydrate for fat loss specifically. So that's on even in a metabolic ward. We have trials done, most notably by Kevin Hall and his group, that have done the big study that was funded by Nutritional. So no superiority there. And we've recently had a more kind of real world example, the Diet Fits trial run by Christopher Gardner, that showed in a real world perspective, again, there doesn't seem to be this superiority for a low carb diet once you have the parameters of overall calorie intake the same between groups. So from a physiological perspective, no difference. If we're talking about for one individual client, would they benefit from a low carb diet? Well, then that's a different question. And it's well worth asking, because that brings up questions like, well, for this individual, if we put them on a low carb diet and that leads them to either just eat less calories naturally, or it changes their hunger levels or their satiety so that they eat a bit less, or they are less hungry on a lower carb diet, therefore it's easier for them to stick to this calorie restriction long term, then that can be a very worthwhile method to go in the real world. On the flip side though, if they prefer eating a bit more carbohydrate or respond better to that or can train better, then they might do better on a higher carb. So it's not that one diet is better than the other from a practical perspective. It's about realizing that if any diet is going to work to induce fat loss in the chronic term, then the underlying reason is calorie restriction. However, different diets can have are just essentially different ways to achieve that calorie restriction. Which one you use for an individual person will depend on a whole host of things, whether they're an athlete or not, whether they enjoy or have a preference for certain types of foods, which diet they just feel better on, whether they have maybe a bias towards one of them, which will induce a placebo effect, which again can be very useful for adherence and so on. So all these things will influence what you do with any one individual, but in a larger term, physiologically, when you match calories and protein, whether you have a low carbohydrate intake or something that's a bit higher is going to have no superiority for fat loss.
I really like how you phrased that, Danny, that you've identified that it's about whether or not one is superior. Too often, I think, in our industry, things are placed in contrast one to another, where, oh, that's not right, so this must be right. And
right.
Perhaps sometimes those who don't have the education to really get into and read into the science, we get lured. Clients get lured by these things. Sometimes fitness professionals get lured because it sounds right. There's some logic to it. But as you suggested there, low carbohydrate diets have been shown to bring about weight loss. Low fat diets have also been shown to bring about pretty effective weight loss. And when we look at the two and we look at the evidence, there's some logic as to why, because these are the two macronutrient foods that are the major energy providers. Protein itself has energy, but we don't really utilize that energy in our bodies that effectively because it's used for other things. So if we're going to then mess with the two primary sources of calories, then clearly that's going to have some influence whether we lower one or the other.
Absolutely.
And I do think that you've nailed it when you sort of said there, sometimes people are trying to see which is the best. And there's a lot of context that has to come into place with regards to which is the best. And certainly the individual, because personal trainers work one-on-one, don't they? They don't work with big cohorts of people.
Right.
They work one-on-one. And there can be some nuances to whether or not one would be more effective than the other, as you've suggested.
Yeah. I think you make a good point about the the change in caloric intake you'll get from restricting either carbohydrate or fat, because typically it's a matter of thinking about where are most people over consuming calories. It's going to be from foods that are dense in calories, but are hyper palatable or very pleasurable to eat, and people find it very easy to overeat on. So not many people are going to be, even if you enjoy steak, for example, you are not going to be massively over consuming calories purely because you're eating too much steak, because you might really like it, but after the first one, you're unlikely to go and have a second, third, and fourth helping.
Sure.
Whether you take something like ice cream and donuts, it's because of the way those foods are set up in terms of their palatability profile. They're so enjoyable, so palatable, and hit that reward center of the brain that it's very easy to consume a large number of calories in a short space of time. And like you say, what do both those foods have? A high amount of fat and a high amount of sugar, typically. Yeah. So if you put someone on a low-carb diet and it causes them, oh, I'm on a low-carb diet, I can't eat this pizza or this donut or this cake, then suddenly, because of those restrictions on their food choices, they're going to lead to eating less calories. So was it because you cut carbs, or was it because they eliminated these calorie-dense foods? Mm-hmm. And that's what it seems to be, because the same thing happens with low-fat diet, like you say, or simply when you just change someone's overall food quality and don't worry about macronutrients. If you don't worry about how much carbohydrate and fat specifically they're eating, but just focus on better quality food. If someone's moved from a very poor, highly processed diet to a diet more based on whole foods, you tend to see great progress because of that. Mm-hmm. Without even thinking about it, they're going to be consuming less calories. So calories are a thing to modulate, but how you go about doing that is the real issue, I think, for fitness professionals. And I think we were kind of getting to that. Mm-hmm. It's that we know we want to manipulate someone's calorie intake, and we want to bring that down. Now, for practice, that doesn't mean just going and saying to this person, go eat less calories. It could be recommending certain dietary changes to them that even without them counting any calories, we know it's going to change what they do with their calorie intake. Mm-hmm. And every dietary method that someone uses to induce fat loss is going to work the same, whether that's intermittent fasting, ketogenic diet, vegan diet, whatever. Mm-hmm. If it's inducing fat loss, it's the same underlying mechanism, but they're working because of different changes you're making in the real world.
I think that's a really valid point to make, and something you alluded to there, which I think is really key, is this concept of managing appetite and satiety. You know, we can mess around with things, but like as you said, some foods don't have much of a satiety index. You know, I can eat donuts, get a huge amount of energy intake, but the satiety that they provide is relatively short-lived and not particularly strong. Whereas if I eat a steak, you know, it's going to have a more potent satiety index, and I may not feel as hungry for long, but understanding, I think, how foods affect the cravings and the biology, I think, is very important. Do you have any thoughts on that yourself?
Yeah. So, I mean, the one thing we see across all spans of interventions on diet is that the big problem for weight loss isn't inducing it in the first place. It's the lack of success rate in terms of people keeping that weight off. Mm-hmm. And it almost nearly always comes back in the vast majority of cases. Mm-hmm. And a lot of that is because people cannot adhere or comply with the certain dietary approach they've put in place. And therefore they're going to go back to either what they were previously doing or just not following a good dietary approach and start gaining back some of that weight. So the big issue you want to focus on is not only what approach right now is going to lead to weight loss, it's what approach can someone actually adhere to and comply with and stay doing, because that's going to be useful. And that's where this kind of conversation shifts away from just thinking about macronutrients to more of the stuff that you just brought up of not only macronutrient wise, but, well, what food choices are going to impact our satiety levels and our hunger levels, and therefore make this diet feel easier or not. Mm-hmm. Because if you're going to be under eating on calories, there are times when you are going to be hungry, right? You're eating less than your body wants. But we can do a lot of things that will impact the degree of that hunger and how full we feel. For example, how much food volume we can have per meal is going to be based on the food choices we make. And that's why that recent trial from Chris Gardner's group, the Diet Fits trial, was so interesting. Mm-hmm. Because not only were they comparing the low fat and the low carbohydrate groups, but they were one of the few trials that really focused on talking to the subjects about food quality, making sure all the foods they were consuming were high quality, nutrient dense foods. Mm-hmm. They talked to them about behavior around food. So not eating with food on your lap as you're on the go, being mindful about it, trying not to eat in front of the TV, making kind of awareness of being in a social environment and enjoying food, all the behavioral stuff and food quality issues, as opposed to just looking in isolation at macronutrients. And what they found with that is that both groups had pretty similar adherence rates to the diets, regardless of the macronutrients. And again, probably a lot of the adherence we can put down to they're focusing on good quality food. That's going to make it probably easier to stick to because you're not going to be as hungry if you're getting your carbohydrates from something like some oats versus getting it from pure sugar or from Coca-Cola or whatever it is. You can match them for carbohydrates, but it's very different in terms of how you're going to influence satiety, fullness, food volume, all that type of stuff.
Cool. I really like that. That's a good answer. Now, if we just, I want to just very quickly highlight, because I think both the calorie restriction concept and the low carbohydrate restriction concept, I think both of them have perhaps sometimes misunderstandings or mistruths about how they're portrayed within our industry. Maybe if you could just address one, because I know there's probably plenty to talk here, but if we first start with low calorie, is there anything with regards to how that tends to be portrayed with regards to eating lower calories that you think needs to be addressed, that we understand in a different light?
Yeah, so I think this is something we'd kind of chatted about off air, that when you have different groups within this kind of nutrition sphere online talking to people within their own little echo chamber, the way they kind of promote their method in some respects is to talk about how wrong these other people are and how idiotic their messages are. And so one that you bring up is you'll have maybe people who are more on the side of talking about specific macronutrient restriction or restriction of certain types of foods or manipulating hormones. That's the real thing you should be doing for fat loss, and don't be worrying about calories. And what they'll talk about is then, all these people that tell you about calories in, calories out, like, it's nonsense. They just say the only thing that matters is calories, and you just need to count calories and that'll be successful, and really build it into sounding something ridiculous, because it is. The thing is that anyone, at least that I know, that's within the kind of evidence-based sphere that talks about energy balance and that weight loss and fat loss over time is going to mainly be dictated by calories in, calories out. No one is saying that calories are the only thing that matter. No one is saying that everyone needs to count calories. They're just saying that whatever you are doing practically, what you're really doing on the bottom line is you are changing calories in, calories out. You are changing energy balance, and that's how weight loss is occurring. And people try to portray that that's not the case. So I just want to highlight for people, when you hear either me or anyone else saying that the main thing that's driving change in body composition is this energy balance equation and calories in, calories out, that is not me saying that's the only thing that matters. I 100% agree things like the differences in macronutrients are very real and how that influences our body composition. Food quality makes a tremendous difference, particularly from a practical level, as we've spent the last 20 minutes talking about. Whether the types of activity someone's going to do, supplements can have a smaller role, timing of nutrients may have some impact. But so there's loads of different things that are at play. Hormones, of course, influence our body composition, but the main thing from a nutrition perspective driving change in body composition is just energy balance. And if someone is telling you about their diet that is working, the reason why it's working is because it's doing something to change energy balance. So whether that's someone that started doing intermittent fasting, the reason why it's doing it is because whatever you're doing with that strategy is causing you to probably eat less food. You're skipping that meal and you're just not accounting for it later in the day, or you do alternate day fasting, and then that second day you're not eating as much to overconsume for the day that you just fasted, whether that's a ketogenic diet that you're just not hungry or restricts your food choices to the point where you eat less, whether it's a vegan diet, again, you just eat less calories because it's hard for you to eat enough from those food choices. Whatever it is, if it's leading to fat loss over time, it's changing via energy balance, but the methods are all different. So,
I get from that there, Danny, that you're sort of discussing is that whether or not calories is the driver for change or whether calories is the result because of other changes that have affected how the person feels, eats, acts. There's so many things at play, which is, I suppose, why it's so difficult for the science to fully conclude that this one thing, because there usually isn't
Right.
the one thing.
Yeah, and especially from a practical level, and that's it. That's why I just don't like people saying, "Oh, if someone's telling you about calories in, calories out, that's idiotic. They're saying calories are the only thing that matters." Like, no one is saying that. No one is saying that. We're just saying that the main thing changing it is at the baseline level. Your physiology is just this difference in energy in and energy out, but on a practical level, that doesn't mean the method to go for you to do that is it has to be via just looking at calories.
Yes.
And regardless of food choices, as long as you look at calories, that's fine. That's not what people are saying. Everyone is, I think, mostly singing off the same hymn sheet of most of your food should be from good quality sources. You should have an adequate amount of protein. You kind of address carbohydrate and fat based on the person's goals and preferences. And then still within those kind of bounds that most people agree on, then what you're really doing, if body composition change isn't occurring, you're going to change calories, because that's the main thing that's going to influence it.
Yeah. So I totally get that, and I think many of the things you said there are so key, that we understand that there are multiple layers here that all influence ultimately what our daily energy balance is. You know, whether I'm eating an excess because I feel this drive to need to eat more all the time, it can vary just by today was workout day and tomorrow is not.
Right.
And sometimes those things are not accounted for. It's flat, this is my calorie intake, and that's what I'm aiming for every day. And if I'm honest, I don't think it's improved by nowadays. There's so many downloadable apps for calorie tracking, and it tends to be the thing that drives a lot of what people are doing, because it is a measurable, an estimated measurable thing to control. Do you, I mean, you've kind of indicated this already, but I get the impression you don't really encourage your clients to track their calories. So how do you help them to manage their actual intake from a practical perspective?
We actually do have quite a lot of clients that either for a set period of time initially, or for those that enjoy it for a lot longer term, track their intake.
Okay.
However, what speaks to what you're saying and what I firmly agree with is that when first people get into this idea of, oh, this calculator will tell me how many calories and macronutrients to consume, I have a big issue with how much faith people put in those and how accurate people feel they need to be. Because I've and I talked about this recently, I think on a Q&A I did, where I've literally seen people who have said, okay, I need to eat 254 grams of carbohydrate each day, and they will go and have like half a biscuit or half a slice of bread in the evening to get exactly to the gram. Like, that's just, it's beyond what is even necessary. Like, there's such a wide gap of what might be useful. The estimates are just rough estimates. You can never be able to get, really, unless you're outside of a lab setting, any idea what actually the energy you actually expended on any one day. And so trying to match that stuff up is just crazy. So
I agree.
what we do work on is more on the average, what is someone's general intake. And we'll make decisions not based on what a calculator tells us, is based on, are they progressing in the right manner? So we'll get them to track, and then at the end of the week, there'll always be a running 7-day average of their calorie intake. And we'll also have a running average of their body weight. And so after multiple weeks, we can now see, okay, on average, is their body weight trending in the right direction that we want? If it is not, we will look at their overall caloric intake each week and say, on the average from weeks 1, 2, and 3, each week it's roughly coming out about 2,700 calories each day. Now, on any individual day, it could widely vary, but that's been their kind of set average that they've been aiming for each week. Now we say, okay, there's no specific number you need to get to, but for us to start losing some body fat, we know it needs to be lower than that. So let's aim for our weekly averages to be 2,400. So now, again, on any given day, their calorie intake can fluctuate up and down based on whether they're training, whether they just wanted to eat something else, whether they had a social occasion. But the average they're aiming is roughly 2,400. Now, it could be, again, plus or minus 100 calories at the end of the week, but roughly within that region. And again, the reason why it doesn't have to be so specific is if it was roughly around 27 and now it's roughly around 24, we know they're definitely going to be consuming less. And then we just start to see, is body weight going in the direction it is? If they're eating sufficient protein and they're doing resistance training, then pretty much most of the weight they're losing, virtually nearly all of it in most cases, is going to be from body fat. And so we're just looking for that change in body weight over time. And so we work more on averages, get people in the right ballpark, and get their body composition moving at the rate that we want, and use that to dictate changes in where their calorie intake comes out.
I really like that, actually, that whole idea of using averages, because the fact that you're using a weekly average takes them away from every individual meal. They're over analyzing what's coming in on a meal by meal basis, and it also, I think, feeds into psychologically the idea that calories are not an accurate method of controlling, because we're only going to track your average. But it gives us a good idea as to whether you're overeating or not. And if you are, then we need to look at what we can do to manage the appetite and the drive to want to eat more.
Sure.
So I really like those issues. Now, we're kind of getting close to time, but we've talked about a lot here. And I wonder whether, just for the benefit of the listeners, when we think of all the different methods we've kind of highlighted, appetite control, protein intake, fat and carbohydrate intake, calorie intake, macronutrients, micronutrients. We've talked about lots of things that can impact someone's drive to eat and to help them in the weight management process. I wonder just if we could try and conclude by trying to put into some sort of order or of priority, maybe the top 3 things that you would be encouraging someone to do if their goal was weight management.
Sure. So the first thing I would get someone to do is probably just take stock of where they're at right now, which is why even if in the long term someone doesn't want to, say, track their intake or keep food diaries or stuff like that, that's totally fine. But I think doing something like that for even a week to 2 weeks can be extremely useful for what it's going to show you. So I would either, if someone doesn't like looking at numbers or gets freaked out by using something like MyFitnessPal, then just keep a normal written food diary for a week or so. If they do want to use the app, then great. Just take your food intake, log it into an app like MyFitnessPal. Do that without trying to hit specific numbers or change your current diet. Do that for 1 or 2 weeks. And what you'll see is you'll start to see patterns of, number one, on average, how much calories you are consuming overall. It might be vastly different to what someone would estimate. Number 2, they'll start to see patterns of, okay, is, say, for example, my weekend vastly different to my weekdays? And now you can start to see by just how much that's probably undermining results. It will also indicate on, is there certain kind of times or certain meals that are really pushing them over on their calories that they wouldn't realize. And then you have a kind of standard set point of like, okay, on the average, this is my average calorie intake this week. This is pretty much me staying at the weight I normally always am. And now you know that whatever you do in the future, if fat loss is your goal, for example, then you're going to have, on average, less calories coming in than that. Now, it doesn't mean you have to track them, but it means you need to make changes to this food intake somewhere that will mean you consume less calories. So it could be substituting certain calorie-dense foods for ones that are less calorie dense. It could be changing your meal frequency. It could be doing some sort of like fasting. It could be whatever that person decides is for them and with their coach, but they do something that's going to modify that intake. So that would be the first point. See where you're at and get used to just figuring out typically how much you're consuming in each kind of meal and day. And then you'll kind of tie in better into, whoa, now I have a better idea about portion size, for example, because I'm seeing I was having this meal that is all healthy foods, but the portions I was using meant that it ended up being 900 calories. And so little things like that are important to learn. Second then is I would think for most people, in the vast majority of cases, I think starting with a pretty high protein intake is typically a useful strategy. If you're doing any sort of exercise or training, it's going to be useful just from a recovery standpoint. If someone is aiming to gain some muscle mass, it's obviously going to be important there as well. But particularly for people dieting as well, it's going to have the double benefit of one, of being able to retain a bit more lean body mass as you lose weight, therefore most of your weight coming from body fat. But the second thing is how much satiety you get from consuming high protein foods is going to make that diet a bit more tolerable and therefore allow you to adhere to it better. So I would think basing a diet on, number one, putting yourself in a calorie deficit, having a high protein intake, and then the kind of third component is where can I make most of my intake from good quality foods, because that is typically going to make it easier to stick to that lower intake of calories, again presuming that people are talking about fat loss here. And so trying to look at foods that are going to be high in fiber, or foods that we can put in say lots of vegetables, which everyone knows is good. Maybe you start playing around with different methods of cooking those vegetables, or do I include them in a smoothie? What way can I increase my vegetable intake in ways that I'm actually going to stick to in the long term instead of having to force myself? So trying to make those substitutions are the first few things I would do. And then in terms of assessing progress, not trying to do it on too short of a time frame. For example, freaking out if your body weight goes up on any specific day, because your body weight is going to fluctuate all over the place. So again, if you're going to take your body weight, try and do it quite regularly throughout the week. Take your average then of those numbers for the week, and then do that each week. And then maybe after 3 weeks, compare the average of week 1 to the average of week 3. And now you have a better understanding of what your weight is doing, as opposed to one random Monday to some other random Monday. And there's a million things that could have influenced your body weight on the scale that have nothing to do with fat loss. So take those averages, see if you're making progress. If you're making progress, stay what you're doing, keep going. If you are not making progress in that direction, you're going to need to modify something that will change those calories, whether that's changing certain food choices, again, changing meal frequency, all the type of stuff we talked about. Do something that is likely to lead to less calories being consumed, whether that's through tracking your calories or not. It doesn't matter. What you're still trying to influence the calorie intake, but through calorie intake or not.
I think it's great to listen to you talk that answer through, because I'd kind of formulated in my own mind before I asked that question what things I would do. And my advice would always have been, number one, assess, don't guess. Just like you said, you've got to know what the person does, and they need to know, because I think often the food diary is such a revelatory experience for people because they don't track their food in that detail. So that would have been my number 1 too. So I'm really pleased to hear you say that. My number 2 would have been food quality, which you had at number 3, and then my number 3 would have been protein for its satiety effects. So it's interesting that even though we've had a bulk of this discussion around, low carb strategy, calorie strategy, things like that, actually we're both in agreement that there are other factors that influence that energy balance in the long term that are much more practical, that are about somebody who has to sit down and eat real food. Right. Is what it comes down to, and learning to understand how different foods influence them so that their overall calorie intake is going to be controlled.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the big thing that people can take away of that, especially with all the confusing messages, like we've said right at the start of the show, that really when you boil down to it, it can be quite simple. It's not going to make dieting easy, but it's still quite simple. That essentially all you're trying to do is make sure you eat an appropriate amount of food, eat the appropriate types of foods, and then the kind of icing on the cake is make sure you get enough protein, because that will help with body composition. Do that alongside sleeping well and being physically active, and you really don't need to spend a lot of time stressing about a lot of the rest of the stuff unless you're an athlete or someone with a very specific goal. If you're just trying to be a bit healthier or lose some body fat, like the vast majority of general population, people that are coming to a coach or a personal trainer or a nutritionist, then really focusing on those things and finding the kind of practical habits and behaviors that allow those things is all you need, because that's what the real coaching is going to come down to. Not understanding, eat an appropriate amount of calories and eat appropriate foods. It's how do we get people to do that is the real kind of challenge.
Of course.
So I think, the things to modify are relatively simple when we kind of turned there, and people are spending so much time worrying about the specific insulin response and carbohydrate differences. I was like, look, keep it simple, but it's about what we do to actually get people to follow certain behaviors. And that's where the kind of cool, interesting stuff comes in.
And I think, what's nice about what you just said there, and would be a great place to kind of conclude on, is that even though we've talked about things like sorting out your food quality, removing processed foods, eating real food, considering your protein intake on a regular basis throughout the day, those things have a knock-on effect upon things like insulin balance and what's going on with insulin. They have a knock-on effect on total macronutrient balance, because you tend to eat more fibrous foods that are lower in carbohydrate.
Right.
So it's seeing how simple steps actually influence some of the science that we've been talking about and influence our total calorie intake. So any final thoughts before we draw it to a close?
Yeah, no, just to echo what you just said, I think it's a great point. And like we said, if you take someone who's overweight or obese and they have all these kind of blood markers that are out of whack and hormone differences and blood sugar super high and all these things that people tell them we need to kind of modify this, that, and the other, if you just start sleeping well, exercising, and you lose body weight just through those basics we do with nutrition, guess what happens? all those blood markers improve. Like without question, all of them will improve if you lose enough body fat and your body composition becomes healthier. So it's not just divorcing health and body composition, these two different spheres we talk about. Like they have a very real interconnectedness. So yeah, completely agree with and echo most of those sentiments.
Thank you, Danny. It's been such a pleasure having you on the show today. And for those who are listening, please go to the blog and see all the show notes, because in there you'll have all the ways to connect with Danny and to even listen to many of his engaging podcasts on this topic on Sigma Nutrition Radio. So, Danny, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me, Ben. I really enjoyed this.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe and share via social media. You can also rate the show on iTunes, Stitcher, or YouTube. If you'd like to know more about us, then check out our range of online courses at www.nordicfitnesseducation.com.